A little bit about the orphan train, and I just want to say we have two special guests here that I'm so excited. Tammy and Mike Sagers are here, and Mike is a grandson of Bill Sagers, that almost everybody here knew Bill Sagers, and he was an orphan train rider. So I just have to start out by saying that probably I'm not going to do justice to this program because there's so much to say about the orphan train. So many wonderful stories, just so much that it could fill 10 brown bag lunches. And I'm already hoping that we can put together a brown bag lunch just about Bill Sagers, who was very, 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 very special. Okay, so one of the many hats that's worn by Jackson County Historical Society, and we're very proud to be this, is that we are the Iowa Orphan Train Research Center, which means that we have all of the available records of Iowa orphan train riders, children who got off the train in all of Iowa, and those are here. And so we take that very seriously that we have that, and it's just a very special thing to us, and hopefully everybody will spread the word that we have those. It used to be called the Placing Out Program. They called it that as they brought children from the big cities in the east to find homes out here. It was kind of the forerunner of the foster care system. It replaced the orphanages and the asylums that you hear such stories about. And at this time, there are no orphanages or asylums in the state of Iowa. So one of the ladies that was responsible for this, was called the Orphan Train Lady. And her name was Mary Ellen Johnson, and she founded and directed the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America, Incorporated. And she did this in 1986, and she did it to preserve the history of all the children that she could find records of that rode the orphan trains, and to educate the public about something that was just a phenomena in our country. It was the largest migration of children anywhere in the world. It took place over a 75-year period. And this phenomena is one of the United States' best kept secrets, because these children were told that they must never ever talk about their past. They were to make a clean break. They were not to tell anyone. They came on the orphan train. They were not to have spoken about this in any way. They were just to forget their past and move forward. And many of these children, most of these children, they have found, really took this to heart. And the only way their family ever found out that they were an orphan train rider was perhaps after they passed away. They'd find some little thing in a Bible or in a trunk or somewhere that gave them a clue that their mother, their dad, whoever came on the orphan train. And so because of this lady, Mary Ellen Johnson, these stories begin to unfold. And they've helped explain away some of the mysteries about the orphan trains. And from that time on, they've tried to help reunite the orphan train riders that were still alive with their former families, or get families connected together so that people knew. This is the little picture of our Orphan Train Research Center, Iowa Orphan Train Research Center, over in the other building. It's a little smaller now, we've rearranged. But you can see the bookcases. We have quite a few books about orphan train riders. We have videotapes, VCH tapes, different things. And then we have files and files and files of records of children that came on the orphan train, Iowa children that came on the orphan train. One of the ladies, so you see the little boy in the background here, okay? This is Bill Sagers. When he came here, 9 years old, I believe, when he came. I think he was 8? I
think he was 8.
Okay, maybe 8 years old when he came, but there he is. One of the people that we owe a great deal of thanks to is this lady. Her name is Madonna Harms, and she opened the Iowa Orphan Train Research Center, and she began to compile all of the Iowa records, because these children went to, like, I believe maybe 45 different states Some of them went quite a ways. And so she began to compile all the information she could possibly find about any orphan train rider. And the materials that she did, those are the records that we now have at our museum, and we feel very privileged to have that. The next person I want to certainly remember is our friend Elaine Marcato. And you think probably when you think of Elaine connected with the Historical Society, she did wonderful research about our Jackson County one-room schools. And we have a book this thick as she gathered photos and stories about our one-room schools. But before that, she was our first archivist for our orphan train material. We really needed help. She stepped up. She got out the many boxes of information that we had received. What happened was when Madonna Harms passed away, her information was all together, and people who were in charge of it were looking for an organization to take over this information, to take charge of it. And so they reached out to junior colleges, they reached out to different places where they thought that this research would be, would have a good home, would be taken care of, and would be used, and where people could find it to trace their history. Well, different groups advocated to get that, and the folks at the Delmer Train Depot went to the place and pleaded their case, and they were given all this material. And so it was all over there at their railroad station in Delmer. And they did a wonderful job of displaying everything. Jim Westhoff, who was such a wonderful man, passed away. He was kind of the person behind all this. And, different volunteers left. And pretty soon there was nobody to take care of it. So it got all put in boxes. And it ended up upstairs in the Delmer City Hall. And so one day we got a call, and they wondered if the Jackson County Historical Society would take charge of this information and organize it and make it useful. So that's where Elaine came in. We went over, we moved everything over, boxes and boxes of records, an old computer and a monitor and just a few other things, and some things we were supposed to get that we never did. But Elaine spent untold hours. If Sue Mayberry were calculating Elaine's hours, they'd be in the hundreds, because she worked tirelessly on this. All of these records that we were told were in really good order were not. We were told that everything was in the computer down to the S's. It was not. So she worked so hard, and now we have a pretty good record. As she was doing all this, she became so knowledgeable, and she was just our go-to person. So another thing that happened as we became the center for this is it's not the front page, but this was an article that Sherry Melville wrote for Our Iowa magazine. And she wrote this 9 years ago, I think in 2015. And so she just told the story of the orphan train and the orphan trains that had come here and that sort of thing. And it was so popular with our Iowa readers that letters kept coming in and questions and things like that. So the next year, they had another article in our Iowa magazine, just talking about some of the questions and some of the stories that they had learned and things like that. So we have those 2 volumes, magazine issues, if you would ever like to see them. But Sherry Melville was the one that did all that. Well, as you can imagine, so many people and I were reading these, it just stirred up a lot of interest. And so Elaine fielded all the calls we got, which were many, emails and letters and visits, by people thinking that perhaps their grandfather might have come on the orphan train, and they were looking for clues. She gave Elaine gave dozens of programs to organizations, some at our museum. She went out on the road. She went as far as Iowa City giving programs. And one of her biggest accomplishments was she wrote a book for us about the orphan train, and we have that for sale in our gift shops. I certainly recommend it to you. And when she went on all these speaking things, she would take these books and she would sell them to her audience, and then she'd bring us all the money. So she was wonderful. She was a great a great historical society volunteer, and we certainly miss her. Another reason for doing this is because on May 17th, we've got a group of homeschoolers that are coming to the museum, and we need help if anybody's interested. They're coming to learn about the orphan train, and we'll tell them about the orphan train story, and then we're going to take them to the Decker House, and we're going to take them to the UCC Church. And we're even going to take them over to Delmer so that they can see what is at the Delmer Depot, and they can hear Delmer's story about the orphan train. So this is coming up, and like I said, we could just help if anybody's really interested. This is going to happen on May 17th. So, reason for this brown bag lunch, I need to brush up a little bit so I can stay ahead of these homeschoolers, because homeschoolers are pretty smart. Okay, so at the time of the 1850 census, just kind of put this in perspective. At the time of the 1850 census, there were 192,000 people living in the entire state of Iowa, okay? At that same time, there were 515,547 people living in New York City alone, okay? So you can kind of see the difference. And of those 515,000 people in New York City, almost 30,000 of those were homeless children. Children living on the streets, children sleeping in boxes and eating out of garbage cans, and children that were stealing in order to survive. And the reason for this, of course, was because it was hard times. And there were so many immigrants coming into this country, and when they got here, they were poor, and they couldn't find work, and they were forced to live in appalling conditions, and there was disease, and it was a terrible situation, and many were starving. Poor sanitation, bad nutrition brought about incredible disease. And so many of these children truly became orphans. Many of them lost both of their parents, and they had no one, and they were just deserted here in a country that wasn't even their own. Others maybe lost one or the other of their parents, or maybe their parents were so destitute that they couldn't feed their children. So they dropped their children off at orphanages just so that they would have somebody to care for them. And pretty soon the orphanages were just bursting at the seams. There was no more room for anybody else, so they were on the streets and they were everywhere, and it was a horrible condition. About that time, there was a man named Charles Brace, and he founded a group called the Children's Aid Society of New York, and he attempted to deal with this crisis. I mean, he could see how terrible it was, and so together he had a team, and they devised a plan to put these children on trains, to send them out to the Midwest, to live with farm families, where they would be out of the city streets, and they would have a chance for a better life. And pretty soon other organizations began sending their children. And remember, this wasn't just New York City. All the big cities in the East, the cities in New Jersey, Boston, all of these cities were having the same problem. So we're talking hundreds and thousands of children. The Catholic Church became involved, and they sent many of their children out by train, but their children came to Catholic families that were prearranged, so it was done a little differently. But trains came from all the large eastern towns, and this went on for 75 years. From 1854, just before the Civil War, until 1929, and the figure, and their records are poor, but the figure is that at least 10,000 children came to the state of Iowa alone. Probably they figure between 150 to maybe 175,000 children came out on those trains. I've even seen estimates as high as 250,000, so, you know, who knows. But there were a lot. So these children were coming to Iowa. Okay, 1854, the same time that this started, the first orphan train headed west, and these children who were homeless, had been in asylums or orphanages, were on the train, and the trains even were overflowing. And even though Iowa was sparsely populated back then, there was still a need even here. Even in Jackson County, we had orphaned children because of the Civil War, because of cholera, because of all of the diseases. So we had our own our own problem as well. But the first orphanage in Iowa is this orphanage. It was the Asylum for Orphaned and Destitute Children in Andrew. And it opened in 1864, just toward the end of the Civil War. And no one should confuse that with the Insane Asylum that was on the county poor farm. That was a completely different thing. That did not house children. So this is the orphanage, the first west of the Mississippi, I believe. It's certainly the first one in Iowa where children were sent. And again, there's that picture of the orphan train, the beginning of the movement. And at the beginning, in the early days, the trains that took children across the country, most of them were little more than cattle cars, right? They only had makeshift bathroom facilities. But as the years went along and more money was available, the trains improved. And in the final years, children even were able to ride in sleeping cars. On any one train, there might be between 25 and 100 children, from infants to teens, and there would be 2 or 3 adult agents that would accompany these children out. These children had no idea where they were going. They were only told that they were going to take a train ride. They were confused and they were frightened. The ones who were old enough to remember their families were told to make a complete break with the past, as I said, and not to speak of it. And so many of those orphan train riders took their memories to their grave. When the children arrived in a new area where they were to live, there was no formal process to place them in new families. What would happen was handbills would be distributed and newspaper articles would appear in advance that these trains were going to be arriving, the day and the place. And then when that day came, it brought crowds and crowds of prospective parents to view and to choose children that they might want to take home. Their part of the deal was that the family had to agree to provide food and shelter and clothing, as well as to see to it that the children went to school and that they went to church. That was the deal. They did not have to adopt the children, but they had to take good care of them. And though the Children's Aid Society made a point of emphasizing the success stories of these children that were cared for and loved, there's no doubt that this was not always the case. Some of the farm families saw these children only as cheap labor. They were never allowed in with the family. They slept in the barn. They ate with the animals. And so some of the situations were really, really sad. And this is one of the posters that would have been posted to let people know when the trains were coming. Okay, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this photo. This brought a lot of interesting conversation to us. This is the depot where the first train. There were 2 trains that came to Maquoketa bringing orphans. I've seen written a couple times where maybe there were 4, but we only really have information about 2. The first train came to this station in 1886. It was maybe not the first station, probably the second station that was on East Platte Street. And you can see the tracks there. And you can see, I think, can you see Maquoketa on the, I thought there, somewhere, if you blow the picture up, maybe you can see Maquoketa. But we had a long argument about whether this was really Maquoketa or not. Because the depot on East Platte Street, to any of our remembrances, never had tracks on both sides of the depot. But you can see train tracks here. This depot had tracks on both sides. So we thought that this wasn't really Maquoketa. But we went to the 1872 lithograph of the city of Maquoketa. You know, at the time that map was drawn and promoted, one of the selling points was that in the future, it was going to provide answers in the future to many questions about Maquoketa's early history, and it really has. And one of them was when we looked on that map, you can clearly see this station and the big building behind it. I think it's a grain barn, grain mill or something behind it, and you can clearly see that there were tracks on both sides of the station. So that kind of proved to us that this was really our picture. So we don't have a lot of information about the first train that arrived. We don't have a lot of newspaper clippings and that sort of thing, which seems strange. But we do know from information that Helen Feeney gave us that this is where Maggie Brown and her two sisters, the Brown sisters, got off the train in 1876. I believe there were 8 or 9 children that got off the train at that time, but you find different numbers in different places. But there has been a book written about Maggie Brown and her sisters, and we do have that at the other store. 3 little girls, and they did not grow up together. They all grew up here in their lives and what happened to them. But they came on that early train to this station. In 1919, the second train came. We know a lot more about that one in 1919. We know that it came to this station that you're probably all familiar with, and it carried 12 orphans, and we know a lot about them. They would have pulled into this depot, rebuilt on the very same spot. Each child carried a small cardboard suitcase, had 2 sets of clothes, one they were wearing and their Sunday best. One of the things that was to come to our research center was one of these little cardboard suitcases, and I remember seeing it, but it never got to us in all the commotion. So that got lost somewhere, which is really, really too bad. So the children all disembarked here. They got off the train with one advisor, and they proceeded to go to the Decker House. And they went to the Decker House to eat and to rest for the night. And then in the morning they would get cleaned up, change into their Sunday best, and then they would walk to the UCC church. At that time, the Congregational Church that had been there for a very long time. It had been well advertised, and the church was crowded. People came to look them over, decide if they would like one of those children to take home, and they would take home. There was no background check. There was no anything like that, but the communities did appoint a board of a couple doctors and probably a couple ministers and a couple well-known family figures that kind of oversaw. So they at least knew the families that these children were going to. 2 people, of course, that you knew from here, and probably really more than that if you thought about it, would be Dorothy Peer Buck and Bill Sagers. And both of them found loving, happy homes, and not that they didn't have hard times through their lives, but they lived wonderful lives. So we'll talk first a little bit about Dorothy. Does anybody here remember Dorothy? Quite a few people do. I do not. I don't think I ever met Dorothy, but she was only 10 months old when she was put on the train. She came from New York. Her unmarried mother had been 16. Her father was 15. And her mother, Arlene, tried to take care of her. She made arrangements with an orphanage in New York to care for her until she could. She found a job as a nursemaid in a nearby city, and she religiously paid the orphanage $2 a week to care for her little girl. And then as soon as she could, in a few months, she went back to pick up her little girl, and she was informed that her mother, because she wasn't of legal age, her mother had turned legal custody of the child over to the orphanage. Dorothy had already been put on a westbound train for Iowa, and she was never able to find her. So, beautiful little babies. They were always the first chosen in the lineup. In Dorothy's case, a lady named Emma Pierce stepped up. She was 46 years of age. She had not been able to have children of her own. She lived on a farm just south of town with her husband James that was 51. And there was a country a little brick schoolhouse on that property, sometimes called Sunshine School, sometimes called the Pierce School. Other names? Bowman School? Okay. Just as you drive out of town, a little brick schoolhouse. That was the farm she lived on. Okay, so go back to this day when Dorothy was taken home by her new mother. James Pierre was shocked when his wife came home with a 10-month-old baby. He knew nothing about it, and she says that he didn't speak to his wife or the child for over 3 months. She was in that house. But Dorothy was a delightful child, and she soon won him over, and she says that she was always spoiled rotten. But that's just kind of funny. In 1920, and just to show, you know, life isn't always, even though she had a second chance at life, life is not always easy. When she was 11, 1929, that's when the banks closed, and the Peers lost all of their money. Her dad died, her adopted dad died right after that, and so her life changed dramatically. She and her mother survived by selling vegetables and raising chickens, and her mother Emma sewed for the WPA. But finally they were forced to sell their property, and they moved to an apartment in Maquoketa. Dorothy graduated from Maquoketa High School in 1938, and she worked for Ben Franklin store to just to get by for $1.17 a day. $1.17 a day. So anyway, Dorothy persevered. She helped take care of her mother. She became a fine teacher, so all of her life was a teacher. She was a teacher. But she had traveled back to New York, and she was able to meet. She finally found and was able to meet her birth mother and her grandmother, and she developed a relationship with them, not a close relationship, I don't think. But while she was there staying with them, she met their neighbor, and she ended up eventually marrying that neighbor, and then they moved back to Iowa. They moved to Iowa, and she had children of her own and became a devoted mother. And she spent her later years, there she is, she spent her later years telling about the orphan train story all around the country as she traveled. And then we have a picture of Dorothy Buck and Bill Sagers. And I just can hardly imagine how many times Bill Sagers and Dorothy told their story to all the little children that, you know, needed to learn. It must have been hundreds of times. But there they are with a class. And I do know that at Briggs School, I don't know the year, they had it's in the book, okay. I know that at Briggs School, Mrs. Kahn, Mary Kahn had a group, and they did a kind of like today's YouTube video that was online. The children all helped and researched, and they interviewed Dorothy, they interviewed Bill, and they had this wonderful story that was online until just a while back. Last time I looked, it wasn't up there anymore. But that was really a fun thing. So let's talk a little bit about Bill. Had I known that somebody knew a lot more about him than I do, but they've promised we're going to do a story about just Bill later on. Okay, so here's Bill, and you can see him here with his brother. He had an older brother, Arthur, and please correct me if some of this is wrong. And then on the other side you see him being held by his father. Bill's story is a little different than some of the others. His mother died, and his father, for whatever reason, we don't know, at least I don't know, his father kept the older brother Arthur, but took Bill to an orphanage. And so Bill ended up on the orphan train at the age of 8.
Relatives did try to keep him.
Did they?
And, yeah, but they didn't have money back then.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, we sure can't assign blame to anyone because conditions were hard.
And he was 3 at the time, and his older brother was
Old enough to take care of himself
so he
all
could
day
take
long.
care of himself
Okay.
all day long.
So Bill was only 3 when he went to the
The
orphanage,
orphanage.
and then at 8 he was put on the orphan train.
Yes.
We didn't know that. That is great, thank you. Okay, so when Bill got to Maquoketa, he was taken in by this woman. Her name is Clara Brady, and you can see Claire there with her other children. Maybe they're not all her children because, I mean, maybe she had taken in other children or adopted children because some of them have different names. Well, maybe some of them are grandchildren. I don't know. Anyway, she had him, and her names are on the records and in the newspaper articles where you see, you know, who took these children home, etc., you always see that he was taken by Clara Bradley. But she kept him only a short time, and as I read, her reason for trying to return him to the orphanage in New York was that he had poor eyesight. Do you know anything other than that?
No, it's a long story.
Okay, it's a long story. Okay,
It wasn't a good story.
okay, but the whole thing is this is his second rejection, right? I mean, he was old enough to know that his father gave him up, and now he was taken by Clara Bradley, and he was given up again. But up stepped our hero somewhere. Okay, this is Jessie Boling Sagers. And she, I think, was a great lady, Jessie Sagers. She was a widow, and she had already raised a family of 12 children. Jessie stepped up, and according to the article, said that he was not to be returned. He was not going back, that she would take him. And although he was never adopted, he had a very great life, and eventually he changed his name legally himself. Since everybody called him Bill Sagers anyway, he changed his name to Bill Sagers. Bill knew he had a brother out there somewhere, but he didn't have a clue how to find him. And when he was in his 90s, because of the power of the internet, the daughters of Bill and his brother Arthur, who were both searching, and they'd searched for many years, but finally they connected and they found each other. And the two were reunited in New York first, and then later Arthur came to visit in Maquoketa. I have to tell you, Bill would come in the museum quite often, and he would tell stories about my great-grandfather who ran the West Side Grocery. And he would tell me how they were so poor, he and Mrs. Sagers were so poor that he was trying to raise money to help out, and he had a little red wagon. And so he'd take his little red wagon to my grandpa at the West Side Grocery. They'd fill it with groceries, and he would deliver it to houses around the neighborhood. So just as a little boy, he was working, and he was working hard. But I love that because he would tell me stories of my great-grandfather that I didn't know. Okay, well, Bill, as we said, he knew that he had a brother out there somewhere, and he found them. And Arthur visited Maquoketa, and I don't know for sure what year that is. It was after 2000. It was probably in 2002 or 3, maybe, when Arthur came to Maquoketa.
It was before that. It was
Was
in the
99, probably 1999.
Maybe
April
99.
1999 is when they have a picture of them being in New Jersey.
Okay,
And
that was
then
in,
right
then
after
he
that.
came
They
here.
came back here. They went to the Dexter and had a big get
Okay,
together of all the family.
okay. Well, I came in 2000. And I remember being at the museum, just volunteering, when Bill came in with his brother. And heard the wonderful story about how they were reunited. You know, just really, really touching. But the interesting thing to me was they didn't grow up together, and yet they were so much alike. They had the same expressions. They talked alike. They walked alike. They were just, you know, and as you watched them walking, they were just so much alike. And just so much joy in being with each other, even though it was so late in their lives. So it was great. So they promised we're going to have later on. We're gonna do Bill upright. We're gonna talk about him. See all the pictures that they have that we don't have, etc. Okay, so these are the Seeberger children. Okay, and these are orphan train riders that came through the Catholic system, and they went to Dubuque, okay? Because pretty soon the Catholic Church could see how successful this was, and they started sending their children out. They were a little more organized because they had families set up to take the children. It wasn't, you know, quite as haphazard. But here you see the Seeberger children, and that wasn't their first name. They were Edingers. And they came by train to Dubuque in 1888. And some of you knew Otto Seeberger, right? Do you remember Otto Seeberger? Okay. So this is Otto Seeberger. He was the father of Ed Seeberger, and I know a lot of you knew Ed Seeberger. And then this is one reason that Asher Schrader, who was such an important part of the Historical Society, was so interested in the orphan train story, because he married Catherine Seeberger, and so he was very closely tied to the orphan train story. But these are the Seeberger children that came.
Bobby.
Yes, thank you.
Wayne's grandmother was also adopted by the Seebergers, so they were brother and sister, adopted brothers.
Okay, I didn't know that. So Wayne's,
Wayne, my husband Wayne,
his
mother's
Mother's.
mother.
okay, his grandmother. Okay, thank you. Another person that you'll probably know, Connie Cressy. Her father was an orphan train rider. His name was Drum, I believe. And I'm sure there are others that you would recognize, but 12 children in Maquoketa at least got off that train in 1919. And again, we have newspaper articles and we have different things. We don't have as complete a story as we would like. And part of I think our frustration as a museum has been because this is such a fascinating topic. I mean, it just grabs everybody's attention. So many fictional books have been written about orphan train riders. And so then they get confused. And it's hard to tell. I mean, I suppose somewhere they tell you, but it's hard to know the real stories from somebody's fictional novel about what happened. So, okay. I didn't move those pictures around. Okay, so back to Elaine. And this is her wonderful book on the orphan train that she wrote. We're going to forever be thankful for her for all of the many hours that she spent, the miles that she traveled talking about this. And so, please sometime take a look at her book. But I wanted to close just by telling you one story that came from her book. Now, this was not a Maquoketa person, but it was an Iowa person. And this is, I'm going to go back, this is John Brady. So this came from Elaine's book. John Brady came west on an early train that stopped in Tipton, Iowa. He was 7 years old when his mother died. His birth father drank heavily and physically abused him. So the police, after having picked him up many times, finally took him to an orphanage. And he saw to it, and they saw to it, that he was put on an orphan train. In Tipton, he was adopted by Judge John Green. Judge Green said, "It was the most motley crowd of youngsters I ever did see." And in later years, the judge said this, "I decided to take John Brady home with me because he was the homeliest, toughest, most unpromising boy of the whole lot. And I had a curious desire to see what could be made of such a specimen of humanity." The judge lived to see John graduate from Yale and the Union Theological Seminary and become an ordained minister. He did not live to see him become a 3-term governor of the Alaska Territory, 1897 to 1905, by presidential appointment. We know that, and again, records are so incomplete. I'm sure there's more that no one knows about. But 5 former orphan train riders are known to have become state governors. Many served in federal and state legislatures. Thousands became teachers and ministers. The orphan train system was the forerunner to the social services of today, and it did serve its purpose. Poor records make it difficult to follow up, but the results of surveys that have been taken through the years of the orphan train riders, in all of the thousands that they did, they could only find two orphan train riders who felt that they would have been better off if they had been left on the streets of New York. So it's just a wonderful story, and wonderful that Maquoketa was a part of that in some small way. So, do you have anything to add? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but please, you want to come up?
We have a book that our son Shane made as a 4-H project that went to State Fair, and it has different articles, and even like when you were talking about the newspaper clippings that came from the Excelsior record, and just different things like that, family pictures and memories.
Good.
That we should do a book.
Okay, so that's a promise. Everybody heard that, right? And there's no hurry. There's a lot of Tuesdays in every year. So there's no hurry. But that would be wonderful because everybody knew and loved Bill Sakers, that's for sure. Any stories, comments?
A couple
Sheila?
questions.
Yeah.
Before the children were sent West,
Yes.
living in the orphanages, who funded their survival in the orphanages?
I don't really know the answer to that. They did say that as more money became available, the trains, you know, they got better, instead of riding in cattle cars, they got better trains. I don't know whether it was states, you know, gave money to the orphanages. I don't know how that was.
I was just
But,
curious.
sure, but most of the kids that got sent came from this, a lot of them came, at least a lot of them, came from the street. And they went to the orphanages and then right out, as far as we can tell.
Okay.
So, really some sad stories. One story that, Annie?
What was the itinerary for the train? Was Maquoketa the final destination, or did they have stops before Maquoketa?
I would think that they had stops because they said there were anywhere from 25 to 100 children on one train. So I think they had designated stops along the way. They had advertised ahead of time in these towns. They knew how many children they were leaving in each
I wonder
town.
why Maquoketa was their destination then.
Well, it was just one of the stops along the way. And these 12 children just happened to be picked to get off at that stop, as far as I can tell. And
I'd only been 12 left by the time they got here too, because like you said, they did do other stops even down into, from what I read, like down into Arkansas even.
yeah, they went to Montana. They went almost, not every state, but a lot of states.
Is there any information available as to why there were so many orphans during those days? Was it all just the Civil War, or was there some other reasons too?
It was all of the immigration, the people immigrating into this country from other, from other countries. They had no money when they came. They came expecting to be able to find jobs. It was, there was no work. They were crowded on sanitary conditions, and so disease just prevailed, and poor nutrition and poor sanitation, and people just died. There were huge cholera epidemics, and there were huge typhoid epidemics, and people just, life was hard, and people just died. And a lot of children died. A lot of children died of starvation that didn't even have the chance to make the orphan train. So, Sheila?
The other question I had is I didn't see any black children in those pictures, and I'm thinking, were they wouldn't be accepted here back then?
I did read a little bit about that last night. There were a few black children that were sent on the orphan train, but not many. And I think there weren't as many black people in this country back then.
I think yes,
Not in the cities,
And, yes, and they were more, whoever said, they were more in the South, I'm sure. And these came from, the bigger cities.
Yeah.
Les?
It's interesting that the first orphanage in Iowa was in Andrew.
Yes.
Do you know much about who or what organization founded that?
We know quite a lot about that. We know, first of all, that it was founded in 1854, but that it took in a lot of Civil War children and that sort of thing. But it was a Lutheran organization. It was part of a Lutheran synod.
Synod?
Yeah, synod, okay. And so it existed for quite some time. It still, it moved to Waverly. And though they say there are no orphanages in the state of Iowa anymore, it did move to Waverly, and it exists for quite a long time.
I wonder if the eastern part of the state populated and developed ahead of the rest of the state because of the river.
I'm sure that's true.
And then maybe there was a higher population center along the river.
Yep, I'm sure that's very true.
Okay.
It's very sparse out in western Iowa, so that's true. I remember, I've read so many of these stories about these little orphan trained people, and I'll just, one more that sticks in my head. There was a little boy that came from Germany, and he was taken home by an old farmer and his wife. And this little boy so wanted to please these people, and so wanted to just be loved and be part of the family. And this old German man had no time for this little boy, and he was treated badly. He was never given even a word of kindness or encouragement or anything, but he never gave up, and he tried and he tried. And then one day, after several years, and he'd grown to be a big, strong kid, one day this old man was out in the hog lot with some sows, and I don't know whether they had piglets or what, but one of them attacked him and he fell. He was older, and he fell, and he would have been killed. But this boy jumped in among these angry hogs and pulled him through the fence to safety. And that changed finally. Finally, that changed that relationship, and that old man accepted him, and they were great friends after that. But it's just sad to read. The happy endings are wonderful stories to read, but there's a lot of not very happy ones. Children living in barns, eating with the animals, absolutely no love, no attention. So, anyway, that's it. We're going to have another orphan train story one of these days. Okay, thank you so much.